guys. I'm Kai Montini as your host of Talk Fame Podcast. It's so hard to believe we're basically halfway to 300 episodes, but as we focus on, we have right now currently joining us is Kat Kennan. Kat is the founder and CEO of Radical Customer Experience, a groundbreaking consulting firm that encourages brands to establish a genuine connections with their customers by embracing strengths-based, trauma-informed, and inclusive marketing services. With a passion by empowering individuals and driving positive change, her mission is to help brands speak up, speak out, and foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in their customer interactions. As a certified trauma and informal professional, Kat brings a crucial perspective to her work, infusing every aspect of her business ventures with a deep understanding of human experiences. Kat's personal experiences have made her a passionate advocate for trauma survivors, leading her to establish a PTS C-PTS advocacy organization and stand up to trauma. Through this organization, she enables others to heal and thrive beyond their traumatic experiences. Kat's unwavering commitment to creating a more inclusive and empathetic would have earned her recognition and respect within the marketing and trauma-informed community. She's leading the charge in losing the way businesses interact with their customers, leaving a profound impact on the industry and society as a whole. We're so excited to welcome Kat to the podcast and dive into so many things, such as how to avoid cancel culture. How are you, Kat? Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I know that was a super long intro. I'm already dying with a long intro, to be honest with you, but thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course, thank you so much for taking the time. But how, tell us more about your trauma experience. I know you've been over a couple of years ago or so. You got with trauma experience that kind of impacted your work, but if people are not familiar with your experience and your journey. Can you maybe tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I certainly experienced childhood trauma, which always colors your lens, and very frequently makes people, and certainly made me feel like an outsider a good part of my life. And starting in 2018, I experienced 3 back-to-back adult traumas that were pretty life-changing. And it gave me a lot of perspective. I realized during that time that our experiences really affect how we perceive messages, whether they're in the marketplace, in the workplace, at home. And I needed to do something about that.
Ooh, I love that. How do you especially as an adult, how did you kind of get through that period? Especially as an adult, you kind of know kind of how to control it. But how do you think you would have reacted if this kind of happened to you when you're younger rather than when you're older?
Yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, I guess in terms of perspective, I've experienced both. I
Mhm.
think, for children that they can't process in the same way that adults can. And, you know, it manifests for your entire life, those experiences. I mean, for me, leaning into therapy was huge. I did a technique called EMDR, which is a specific regimen for trauma survivors. It's also used for vets and other folks with PTSD. It essentially, it trains your brain to realize that the trauma isn't happening now, that it's happened in the past, which is what happens with PTSD. But I think aside from that, it's really important for the listeners to remember that trauma is everywhere. And, we can put PTSD, et cetera, in its own bucket, but every single human on earth has experienced trauma for at least something, especially if you just look at the lens of the pandemic. I mean, that clearly affected every single one of us on earth. And certainly changes our perceptions in terms of, how we communicate or receive communication.
Yeah, you make a really great point because especially with the pandemic, everyone has been through something in their life, traumatic or non-traumatic. Especially with the pandemic, it really made an impact on everyone in a way, whether it's like staying home or no getting sick and losing family members or losing their jobs. Like it really just, impacted everyone in some way. And like especially with dealing with trauma, whether it's like you're very young when you deal with it or you're older, everyone has like a different way in terms of how they deal with it, whether it's like going to therapy, journaling, meditating, like everyone has a different way. But I feel like you said earlier, mostly basically every adult knows kind of how to react rather than, when you're a little kid and don't know what's going on and we have to rely on help for that. I'm not saying adults rely on help, but also kind of like like we know kind of what to do more in that situation.
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think like we are in the middle of a mental health crisis, and it's not easy for everyone to get help for multiple reasons. In a lot of cases, the resources aren't there, or the insurance to pay for those resources isn't there. And, there's also a certain amount of self-work, self-work that you have to be ready to do. And, not everyone realizes the impact that trauma has had on their lives.
Mhm.
So, I consider myself extremely lucky that I've even been able to work, on issues. A lot of times if you come across someone, and it could be, at work or in class or, somewhere else in your personal life, and they're really angry about something, anger is a secondary emotion.
Mhm.
There's always something going on underneath that. And, that's what I encourage people to remember. When someone lashes out, there's always something going on, that's deeper than that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
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 Like, it really is. It's like, I know, like, when people are maybe having a social, doing something social with their friends or family, like, it can be, very, like, easy to tell when someone's angry or upset or going through something based off of what they say or what they do or how, like, kind of how they explain themselves in a way, like, or how, like, the body language is and how they kind of, like, their tone is, because it's really easy to tell depending on the person. Not everyone's able to tell, how this person is. But it's like when you're dealing with trauma, it's very easy to be very angry. Like sometimes you don't know you're going through trauma until you're older, and you're like, oh my God, I went through trauma as a kid that I didn't know about until say a month ago. Sometimes it
Yeah.
can be very hard to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, like, what is kind of like the importance of trauma-informed marketing?
Yeah. So the term trauma informed does come from the therapy space, and is really about how you speak to people, how you put out messages, because you're trying to avoid triggering, patients. And so I've taken those principles, and I was trained as a trauma informed professional as well. Um, and I've applied them to marketing. So I am a career marketing leader, and it's really about how you communicate with your customers, what
Mhm,
words you choose, what imagery you choose, the kinds of campaigns you put out. Um, I'll give a really, really tangible example. So the holidays, regardless of when they happen during the year, tend to be really triggering for people. There's a lot of folks that just have a hard time with holidays, definitely end of year for sure. But take something like Mother's or Father's Day. So many of us have lost a parent, maybe no longer speak to a parent, or vice versa. And, every single email, every commercial, every social post we see is all about don't forget mom, don't forget mom. These are great gifts for mom. And so it's can be really daunting and overwhelming for someone that perhaps has experienced loss. And a couple of years ago, I actually got a text, SMS campaign from a brand called Uncommon Goods that said, hey, we know this time of year is tough for many of you. Click here to opt out of our Mother's Day messaging. And as a customer and like someone that loved that brand for years, I was like, they see me, right?
yeah.
You know, I am safe with them. They see me. And as a marketer, I'm like, oh, they're just segmenting their database in a really smart way, because,
Mhm.
you might be sitting there getting all these messages and bombarded from, maybe it's a particular brand or several brands, and you're just hitting unsubscribe. You're not going to deal with that. You don't want to receive any of their messages ever again. And instead, as an example, they put out a message sort of anticipating that, some of their customers, this was really going to resonate with.
Mhm.
And even for those it didn't resonate with, it would still have a positive net effect. And other brands have adopted this past year. Etsy did it, Ancestry did it. So I don't think they're necessarily using the term trauma informed marketing, but that is an example. It's really about leading with empathy and leading with heart.
Yeah, I love that. I never knew a lot of companies did that. Like that's actually a great idea, whether it's like Mother's Day, Father's Day, like you said, or even Christmas. I know Christmas, it can hit home to a lot of people, like losing a loved one prior, and it really can impact a lot of people. And I had a conversation with someone yesterday about how Christmas can be hard for some people, whether it's like losing a loved one or trauma or something. And I'm just like when I hear those experiences, I'm like, that's like it's hard to believe how much trauma people are going through during the holidays or when things really hit home for people. Because I know with me, during each Christmas, it can hit home for me as well. Because when I lost my grandmother a few years ago, it was her favorite holiday. So
Yep.
sometimes it will hit home, like where it's like you're losing a grandparent and that was her favorite thing. Like your family went over to their house every Christmas Eve or something. Like it can mean so much to people, whether in like whenever organizations or companies are reaching out, it can make people, like you said, feel seen
Hmm.
because when companies are saying like, "Oh, you can unsubscribe if you're like if you don't want to receive this," it can help. It can become some sort of relief to
Yep.
realize that okay, I'm so happy they're doing this, so I won't have to worry about missing my parents even more through the time.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And, the chances are is they're going to give you more business in the future. In my case, since I received that message and during before the first Mother's Day that my mom had passed, um, you know, I've now told, I don't know, thousands of people that story,
Mhm.
and that helps that brand as well. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and how can companies kind of avoid cancel culture?
Yeah. So it ties in a bit because, so I think the majority of the time when a brand is called out, and that can be a celebrity as a brand or a company, right? I
Mhm.
think that it's normally justified. There usually is something that is, you know, that has surfaced, whether it's like something that was put out, a number of years ago, or perhaps a campaign. We had some really big examples this year with Target taking Pride merchandise out of store. Um, and so it's usually justified, but we have at RCX, we've put together some software that essentially it provides a tool for brands to send to their customers, and it asks very, very specific questions about brand trust. Like, if this brand made a mistake, do you trust that they would own up to it? Would they mean the apology? Do you feel seen by them? Like very, very specific questions that aren't asked elsewhere. And what the system does is it essentially predicts the risks they have to being canceled, because if their customers are perceiving them in a certain way, then they're definitely at risk. And I'm sure you appreciate this too. Like, while some older generations maybe don't complain to companies because they just expect to be treated poorly, right?
Yeah,
They
yeah.
expect things to go wrong, and it's almost a learned helplessness.
Mhm.
But we know from our research that 83% of consumers feel that brands do little to nothing to repair negative experiences.
Mhm.
And for younger generations, whether it's millennial or Gen Z, and we're fast coming up on Gen Alpha, they don't get second chances, right? There's one negative interaction and they're done with that brand. And so, overall companies are at risk as their customers age out, that, they are not going to get any kind of loyalty going forward because there's no forgiveness from a misstep.
Yeah, and like it can also, affect people that are coming up. Because also when people want to buy stuff from these companies, or it's like maybe Amazon, Target, Walmart, or some of those big companies that are popular to today's generation and today's world, it can really just impact the way people have negative emotions to what it is bought and the way the company wants to treat it. It's like you said, 80% of most of the companies don't really do anything about it. So it's
Yes.
really like the way you can try to change and shift that to really help younger people coming up to make sure that their problem is solved and not have to deal with nothing about it, not have to stress about something, out of their control, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, that is a tool that we offer and we've developed in-house. But you certainly, like, based on my experiences in both marketing and with trauma, I have a lens that no one else really has.
Yeah, and research has shown that 75% of people have experienced at least one major traumatic event in their life. Like, what do you think causes people to have a traumatic event in their life?
Yeah. So I think you see that stat, and it's from like World Health Organization, the CDC. One, trauma is vastly underreported. And again, with COVID, we know we're looking at 100%, right?
Yeah.
But it can be things that you normally maybe wouldn't consider a major trauma. Changing jobs can be extremely traumatic. Moving homes can be. Obviously, if you lose, a friend or family member during the pandemic, 40%, it's a huge amount of people lost someone that they know. And, it can be all sorts of things. It certainly can be adverse childhood experiences. It could be, relationship trauma. It could be, generational trauma, which is super interesting. So, we're actually, like, in our bones and in our DNA, and the research proves this, holding up to 14 generations of trauma and within us. And so even if you've had a quote unquote perfect life, which no one has, right?
Yeah, correct. Correct.
we still have it's literally in our bones, all of these generations of trauma. So, that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and that's like the reason research is the thing, because like when we see the research, we wouldn't know how many people are dealing with this until we see an actual fact by a big company that is important, that is, conducting research on not just the United States, but also around the world. And like Gen Z, and also is not the only people that deal with trauma. It's also really adults as well. It's not just
Yeah.
like the Gen Z people, because I know like what the pandemic, it really did, make a traumatic thing, like traumatic piece of people in a way. And like in a way, it did make an impact on me in a way, because like with me not being able to have a connection with people and going out and doing all the things I used to do, like, and it was honestly just very hard to not live the life I wanted before. And I'm sure it was the same for you as well, but everyone deals with trauma in a way, though. Like even
Yeah.
like 75%, like you said, it could be 100% now.
Yeah.
It's gonna be very different from what it was last year or 3 years ago when the
Yeah.
pandemic started.
Yeah, absolutely. And just specific to mental health around the pandemic, I mean, instances of depression and anxiety increased by 25%,
Hmm.
including actually suicidal ideation, and completions increased by 10%. So, you know, there is a real crisis happening. And I think it's time for companies to take a stand, just because there's no other entity really in the world that touches as many people as brands do.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one of their customers gets impacted by how they message. And,
Mm-hmm.
if they start thinking with empathy and heart, that affects every single one of their customers.
Mm-hmm. That is so true because because when people are looking at companies, I know a lot of people do this, but I know like when they're looking at them, they really do rely on the message they send. Because like
Mhm.
when you see what they're all about and what do they support, what do they not support, it can really like impact the way people buy from these brands, especially in 2023. Like a lot of companies do have a lot of messages that people might disagree with. So it really is like with I think companies or businesses is really one of the most important factors in today's society that really impacts the way we do things and the things we support every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, research indicates, and this comes from Edelman's Trust Barometer for the last several years, and certainly this year, that, it's almost 65% of consumers expect brands to stand up for issues that are important. And, conversely, most executives and marketers are actually terrified of saying anything at all for fear of being canceled. And so there's a juxtaposition there
Mhm,
that, I think the key thing for brands to remember is that whatever the issue is, it really has to be within the DNA of the company,
mhm,
or it comes across as inauthentic. If you want to think about, say, Patagonia, for example, you can't think about them without thinking about sustainability. It is
mhm,
100% in who they are as a company.
mhm,
Or, uh, for many, many years, things like cause marketing or donating a share of your profits was enough for companies, to engage in social good. And it's no longer good enough. It needs to be authentic investment, in their communities, into an issue or cause that is deeply woven into who they are as a company. And, otherwise, like, people, they just don't put up with it. They don't believe it. They don't trust the brand. And then their business, sustainability going forward, is really, really at risk.
mhm, it really is, but, like, what kind of does trauma look like for some people? Because I know that every, like, process of people, every trauma situation looks different on people, but, like, what did kind of, traumas look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can look different for everyone. You can certainly think about, you know, um, trauma around gender, trauma around, race and ethnicity. I can think of, was this last year, I think, where Walmart put out an ice cream for Juneteenth. Uh, very, very big mistake. Um, just not well thought out, not well received. They got in a lot of hot water for that. And they were crucified online, and justifiably so. You know, um, I think everybody's experiences with trauma are different. But one, sometimes traumatic experiences are smaller than you would think, and sometimes there are a lot more global issues, like institutional racism, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Like even with like the Walmart things, like the Walmart with Juneteenth, like it can really make one decision they made on something. It can really just make an overall impact from what they did before and from losing customers due to that one decision. Like that's how big a decision can make from big companies like Walmart
Yeah.
or Target or Amazon or any
Yeah.
company. Like this
Yeah.
one
So,
decision.
I mean, if you want to go back to the Target example, so after they made that decision about removing Pride merchandise, they lost 90%, 90 of their stock value. And
Really?
yeah, and it still hasn't rebounded. So, this is enormously costly for companies.
Yeah, that's crazy. 90%? I had no idea that they got up that much. Like I
Yep.
That's absolutely crazy. But like when you first started out to where you are now, like how would you kind of change the way you made genuine connections when you first started out?
I don't believe in looking backwards. Everything that I've experienced, whether negative or positive, I'm very grateful that I experienced, because I I think that this person that's speaking to you right now, Kylie, is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I'm awesome. And you can't go back and change decisions there. I don't believe in regrets. I don't think that that's a productive lens.
Yeah.
Um, but certainly would I have been able to connect easier with people, especially in the earlier part of my life without childhood trauma? Sure. But then I wouldn't be this person. So that's the lens that I have.
Yeah, like, I love that you do that because I know like with a lot of people, looking back can really just impact the way people react. And that's a situation I'm gonna be completely honest with you. Like that's something I do all the time that I'm trying not to put on myself. Because of course, like childhood to where you are now can really impact you as a person from looking back on that situation, be like, okay, well, how was
Yeah.
that me? Like, am I that person still? Or how did that mistake on my in my job or something that I do as a hobby or as a side job make like made a part on me and also the company that I work for or I'm volunteering for or whatever it is. So like when you like looking back on that, like it's not good, for the soul or for your well-being. Like when you look back, you're like, I'm not the same person as I was, 20 years ago, for
Yeah.
example. Like
Yeah.
every decision you made over the last couple of years were good, in the moment. You might not be good at this current moment. You might be like, okay, well, this decision might be good back then in that job, but maybe not for now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
But like, how can we empower each other in our customer interactions?
I think it's just, it's taking a beat. It's,
Mhm.
instead of being so reactive, it's just like giving yourself time. I mean, obviously, like things like AI are like changing every day and expanding, but I always say like technology isn't good or bad.
Mhm.
So maybe you've written an email or you've written social posts and you're like, what is this language like? Like, should I be looking at this a different way? Hey, put that into Chat GPT and say, hey, will you rewrite this with a more empathic lens? Right? At least it'll give you something to start with and you'll be able to compare the language. I think that's just a really good tip for companies to communicate differently, because it's a big change. And there are a lot of outside pressures on marketers, whether it's the executive team or the board or Wall Street or they're expected, almost double digit growth every year. And they just don't have time, you know?
Yeah, that's so true. But like, how does the last thing I have for you before we have run out of time is like how does stand up to trauma kind of help people from their trauma experiences?
Yeah. So, I can sort of consider it a sister organization to Radical Customer Experience. It's my advocacy organization. And essentially, it's, a place for people to share their stories.
Mhm.
With a lot of trauma, there's so much shame and, just darkness around it. And I think, whether it's me or anyone else, if you're given a platform to share your story, and on Stand Up to Trauma, you can do it with your name, you can do it with another name, you can do it anonymously. Um, it gives you your power back.
Yeah.
And I think for people who maybe aren't ready to share their stories, just knowing that there are survivors out there sharing theirs, can be really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think you don't ever really heal from trauma. I always say that I'll always be healing, right?
Um,
Yeah. But I think sharing story is a great way to keep the healing process going.
Mm-hmm. Like, especially when you share a story, whether it's like a thing they suffered for years or that felt a loved one or anxiety and depression. Like, for example, like I grew up with anxiety, depression my whole life. Like it was always a part of me. It never left me. There's always a way. Like it's always been part of my life. It's never in like a traumatic experience or anxiety, depression never leaves you in a way. It's everyone's
Yep.
still healing. And I shared this before a couple times before the podcast, but like it took me like years and months to tell people about what I was going through besides my parents and like the immediate family because I felt embarrassed. I was like,
Yeah.
why I feel so embarrassed on what I was going through, like why did I go through that? I'm so stupid. But that's a part of like I know a lot of people do feel embarrassed on what they went through. Like whether it's like sexual abuse, anxiety, depression, trauma they've been through, or the way they feel about certain things. Like no one is going to judge you on how you felt. 'Cause every person
Yeah.
is different, and maybe not that person that you're telling might not have been through it, but it's always good to have someone be there for you to
Yeah.
help you through that. Because if you don't talk to anyone about it, or you just don't feel that emotion to really tell people, that's okay. Like
Yeah.
you don't have to say like you don't have to say it immediately after whenever you're ready to talk about it. And some people never talk about it. You're like, okay, this
Yeah.
is a personal matter. But it's always good to have that like resource, whether it's like your organization, Stand Up to Trauma, to have that like anonymously say your story without knowing what their name is. So it'll be much easier. And there's also a bunch of hotlines out there for
Yeah.
people that are going through suicidal thoughts or anxiety, depression, or trauma or domestic violence. Like there's so many hotlines out there that can help so many people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I mean, on the personal side, I certainly share a lot about my trauma because I know hearing my story and hearing sort of where I am, can be very, very helpful to other survivors or maybe people who are still currently going through, a traumatic experience. And, that's how I can personally, make a difference in the world. And, on the flip side of it, with my company, I can help other companies, make an impact on all of their customers.
Yeah, like that is like this amazing work because like even if I speak about like my journey every once in a while in episodes, whatever on whatever occasion it is, I might mention it, but it's like just to remember if someone's listening to this that might be going through trauma or anxiety, depression. There's no like it's like when people share their stories, it just makes people less alone in that situation. Like, okay, well, Kylie must have been in that situation, or you went that situation. Like it makes you feel less alone in that situation. It makes people kind of more comfortable to talk about it and share their stories throughout social media, or even to their family or strangers. Be like, "Hey, I'm a
Yeah.
survivor."
Yeah,
This is like
absolutely.
because your voice is always heard. Like no matter who you tell, it's always very important to show it, no matter how hard it is. Because no matter how hard it is, you're strong either way if you mention it.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
But I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It means so much. Your work is seriously so awesome and it is making such an impact on so many people. It was such a pleasure speaking with you. And like by the way, before we head off, like how can people connect with you if they want to kind of chat with you or learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can always find me on LinkedIn or other socials at Kat Kennan. But the website is radicalcustomerexperience.com. And for survivors who might be interested in reading other stories or sharing theirs, it is standuptotrauma.com.
Perfect. So make sure everyone to rate, review, subscribe. We're always looking for different ideas and talking with different people. So thank you everyone for listening and thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was so great to meet you and I hope that you have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Of course, talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.